thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. And today we are going to talk about investor visa options in the United States. And we're going to go over a number of different types of investor visa options. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you do have questions during the presentation, you can add those questions in either the Q&A box or the question and answer, the question and answer box, or either the chat box. We will get to all questions, so definitely feel free to add them. We may not answer the question as we're going through the presentation, but we save time at the end as well for questions. The other thing to keep in mind is that after the presentation, we will send you some information. So the information that we'll send you, this is being recorded, so we will send you a link to the recording, so you will have that handy. We will also send you guides on all of the different visa options that we're talking about. So there are comprehensive guides that go over the details in much more detail that you can utilize at your convenience. And then the other thing that we're going to send you is a consult link. So if you do decide that you'd like more information, you can set up a consultation with one of our lawyers to go through one of these different visa types. And then finally, the visa types that we're going to talk about, we're going to touch on them at a high level here, but we do have separate webinars for each one of these visa types. And sometimes the webinars themselves might be an hour long for each visa type. So you can have two choices. One, as I said, this is going to be recorded, and as all our webinars are recorded, we convert them into YouTube videos and add them to our YouTube channel. So you can go to our YouTube channel and see past webinars, or you can actually subscribe to the YouTube channel and receive information as new webinars come in as well. So as the information is updated for these particular topics, those updates are incorporated into the newer webinars. So seeing a new one might be what you want to do. But then also you can also sign up for one of these webinars, and then that gives you the ability during the webinar to ask questions as well. So without further ado, we will move to the meat and potatoes of the webinar. So these are the 4 different visa types, and we use the term visa and green card interchangeably, but these are the 4 different investor visa types that we're going to talk about. Arguably, there may be more. There are some other visas that can be used by investors, but these are the kind of primary ones, I think, that are used. And those are the E2 visa, the National Interest Waiver visa, the International Entrepreneur Rule, and that one we have it on the slide, but it's one that is underutilized, but for good reason. And then the EB5 investor green card. Now let's start out then with the E2 visa requirements. Now the E2 visa is a visa that is quite near and dear to our hearts because the firm was founded on an E2 visa. So we could use our case as the example to describe what the requirements are. And first and foremost, you have to be a member of the treaty country, a national of the treaty country. And what that means is that you have to have a passport from the treaty country. So I'm Canadian and I have a Canadian passport. So that makes me eligible at least to apply. So there are about 80 or so treaty countries out there, and and they're all over the world. So there are countries in South America, there are countries in Europe, the countries in Africa, Australia and New Zealand are treaty countries. Israel's a treaty country. Many in Asia as well, treaty countries. Japan, Korea. So lots of countries to choose from. 2 of the world's the most populous countries, unfortunately, India and China, are not E2 visa treaty countries, but many others are. So the key with an E2 visa is that you make an investment. So you do invest in either starting a business or purchasing a business. So either would work, and the funds have to be at risk. So that really means that the money was spent, that you couldn't just say set up a legal entity and then have money sitting in a bank account and say that I want an E2 visa. You'd have to have more than that. You'd have to actually spend money. So it might be that you spend money on inventory, on rent, on hiring employees, or whatever it takes to get the business up and running. You'd be required to do that. You have to show where the money came from and show that it came from a legitimate source. So if it was from your personal savings, you might show tax returns and bank statements. If it was from a gift, you'd have a gift letter and then details on where the person who gave the money to you got that money from. It could be from the sale of property, either securities, equity, or a house. And then it could be a loan, and loans are fine for E2 visas. Unsecured loans are fine, or secured loans are fine if the secured loan is secured against your personal property, or if, as I said, unsecured is fine. But the only loan that's not fine is if the loan is secured against the assets of the business. So if you were, for example, had mortgage, real estate in your portfolio of the business, and the real estate had, a mortgage, then that wouldn't work for an E2. That wouldn't work for an E2 visa. The investment must be substantial. We're going to get to that in the next slide to talk about that in a little bit more detail. The types of things that you spend money on, some of these I've mentioned already, but it could be inventory, office supplies, equipment, rent. You could have money that you spent on hiring employees. You could buy Google ads, prepay them. The money that you spend on setting up the entity, or you're paying your lawyers. All of those are going to be included. And then obviously, if you're purchasing a business, the investment amount is just going to be the amount that you paid for the business, the market value that you paid for the business that the seller wants. If you are purchasing a business, you do have the opportunity to put the money in what's called escrow. So what's involved there is, instead of giving the money directly to the seller, you might give the money to a third party and hold it in escrow. And then once the E2 visa is approved, if this works, if the only condition is the approval of the E2 visa, once the visa is approved, then the money would move to the seller. So that's definitely an option for you to do. The other big thing with an E2 visa, and it's really what E2 visas are all about, is that the business cannot be marginal. So the business, what that means is that you have to hire U.S. workers. So it could be that when you first start the business that you don't have any workers, but then you would have a business plan that shows that you plan to hire workers over a period of time. And in terms of workers, you really are looking for at least the equivalent of 3 full-time workers over a 5-year period. So that's what you would be looking at as well if you were buying a business and you were purchasing the business, and the employees were actually working at the business. You'd want the equivalent of 3 full-time workers, or the ability to increase the number of employees over time. So the other thing is, the business has to be real and operating. So you're going to look at things like, bank account set up, the entity's been set up, there's lease agreement. And because really what we're getting here is that and it's a scary thing about the E2 visa, is that you apply for the E2 visa after you've done everything, after you've spent all the money, et cetera. So it is a somewhat scary proposition. But it is, this visa is not issued for people who just intend to invest. It's issued for people who, either have invested, or are at the kind of the final stages of the business being open. And you have to own, if you're getting an investor visa anyway, you have to own at least 50% of the company and have intent to return to your home country. But once you no longer have the visa. Now, the visa can be renewed indefinitely, so you can stay on an E2 visa for years. I'm in the US on an E2 visa. I've been on the E2 visa for 10 years, and I could, in theory, stay in the US for the rest of my life on an E2 visa, as long as I continue running the business and hiring US workers. So now we get to probably the number one question that people ask us with E2 visas, and that's how much investment is enough for an E2 visa. And really, the regulations don't set a specific amount of money with respect to how much you have to invest, and it really does depend on a few things. So the type of business. So if you're starting a service-oriented business, you're going to be able to invest a lot less than if you're starting, for example, a car manufacturing plant, or starting a restaurant or something like that. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And the other kind of thing is where you apply. If you're applying through USCIS and the government doing a change of status, then really a lower investment amount would be fine. They don't seem too fussed with lower investment amounts. But if you're applying at certain U.S. consulates around the world, they may have a much stricter limit in terms of, in terms of the amount they need to invest, like, well over 100,000 or something like that. But we have done E2 visas with very low investment amounts, but they just are riskier cases. So we've done E2 visas with as low as even 15,000 spent but I say that emphasizing that they're very, very risky cases, right? So we have done smaller amounts, but we tend to advise clients to spend at least $40,000. But even then, you're looking at a risky E2 visa. And then when you're looking at how much of the amount you have to spend, generally, if the amount is low, so if it's 500,000 or 500,000 or some amount like that, then the issue is that you're going to have to spend all of it, right? 100%. If your investment amount is maybe like, let's say in the millions or something like that, then you could spend a smaller percentage, and that smaller percentage would still be considered substantial for the purposes of this. When you're buying a business, generally, whatever the cost is that the cost of the business is, that's going to be what the investment amount is. But that's if it's an arm's length transaction, right? If you're buying a business from a relative, then you're going to have to provide documentation related to how it is you came up with the purchase price. And then franchises are really good options for E2 visas. We have a separate webinar on E2 visas for franchises. So that's something that, I think consulates really, really like to see that. And then with E2 visas, when you're spending money, they're kind of what we consider good expenditures and bad expenditures. Like, good expenditures are the ones that we listed on the previous screen, like equipment or lease or employees, whereas bad expenditures might be things like, money that you spend on food or travel and things like that. And generally speaking, we wouldn't want to even include those expenditures in a file, because they don't really benefit the file, and they could even be detrimental. There are certain consulates that list on their website that they find those types of expenditure additions in a file show that the person lacks business prowess. So so it could be even detrimental including those things in a file. And we're pretty good at making, indicating to people what it is we think should be included in a file. So that is the E2 visa, and as I said, a great visa. We've done hundreds of E2 visas, and a great visa if you at least meet the threshold requirement of having a passport from a treaty country. And as I said, it doesn't matter where you were born. It's just having a passport from the treaty country. A couple of kind of interesting things that happened with the E2 visa recently. One is that up until a few weeks ago, an individual could purchase citizenship in another country. So Grenada, for example, allowed individuals to get passports, quite quickly by investing as low as, I think around $300,000 or something, and you can get the passport quite quickly. And so we've had clients that have done it as well, that have applied for an E2 visa based on that Grenadian passport. But the rules just changed where now if someone gets a E2 visa nationality based on purchasing it from investment, then they have to have resided in the country for 3 years. So that's something that has changed. The countries that are eligible are constantly, not constantly, but they sometimes do change. So recently, Portugal was just added as an E2 treaty country. Israel was relatively recently added. New Zealand was relatively recently added. And then sometimes countries drop off the list as well, like Ecuador dropped off the list, and there are a few others as well. So something to keep in mind, but definitely a great visa if you do meet the threshold requirements. So then the next area that we want to talk about is the National Interest Waiver. Now, this is a green card. But this is an option that is available to entrepreneurs, and really since 2016, 2017, because it was a famous case. It's called Danisar, and Danisar really introduced the idea that a national interest waiver could be introduced for entrepreneurs. So since then, we've done many for entrepreneurs, and it's definitely an excellent option, and it's a green card option. So something that definitely can be can be, when you look at it, definitely something that you can look at, and if you want to ultimately become a citizen. So the first thing when you're looking at national interest waiver, though, is, and keep in mind, we have separate webinars for each of these. So E2 visa, we have separate webinars, question and answers. E2 visas for high risk cases. National interest waiver, we have 2 webinars, one national interest waiver for entrepreneurs, then regular entrepreneurs, and actually then another one on national interest waiver questions and answers, and they're all about an hour long. So these are just highlights. But in order to apply for a national interest waiver, you first have to meet what I'll describe as a threshold requirement. That's just that you have an advanced degree or equivalent, or you have what's called exceptional ability. So the first, advanced degree is master's degree or higher. The equivalent would be bachelor's degree plus 5 years progressive work experience. And that, or if you don't have either of those, then you can look at these 7 criteria that are listed on the slide. And if you meet 3 of those, then you can, then you move to step 2. So this is the easy part. Right? This is the easy part. So then step 2 is the actual requirements of national interest waiver, because EB2, the threshold requirements apply not only to national interest waiver, but just the regular EB2, just when a company is sponsoring you for a green card as well. So the 3 prongs, the 3 requirements are that the endeavor you have proposed has substantial merit and national importance. So basically that's saying that what you plan on coming to the US to do is important to the US government. The second is that you're well positioned to advance the endeavor. And the third is that on balance, it's beneficial to the United States to grant this to you. So this, the 3 prongs seem like they're quite straightforward and simple, but these are very, very complicated petitions that require a significant amount of assessment and kind of strategy when we're pulling them together. So definitely, I think it's a great option, but they definitely require a significant amount of strategy, because you first have to sit back and kind of define what is the endeavor, what is it the person's coming to the United States to do, and you have to define it in a way that's grand enough such the government would say, well, this is in the national importance. Then when you go to step 2, that moves to the individual, and now you're saying the individual, are they well positioned to advance the endeavor that they indicated above, right? So then we look at things like their work experience, and we look at their resume. It could be, if it's on for entrepreneurs, it could be we're looking at, is the company capitalized? Do they have a business plan? Do they have customers? How viable is it? And then another big thing is they want to see, does the person have a track record? Have they done this before? And if they have done it before, kind of what has their track record been with respect to a particular accomplishment with it? So definitely, a great visa category if you meet the requirements. And we actually do a lot of E2 visa to national interest waiver cases. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. So when we look at this particular area for entrepreneurs and investors, one of the areas when we said, the first prong that we talked about, the substantial merit and national importance, a lot of the time what we'll point to is the economic benefit, right? So we'll say that that job creation is in the national interest, and the government has said that. So that's one of the things we point to. And then the other thing that the case has said, that the geographic scope doesn't have to be like all of the United States. So you could have a national interest waiver case where someone is just kind of starting a small business in an economically depressed area, and that in itself could be, and then creating jobs in that particular area, and that in itself could be in the national interest. So something to keep in mind. The other kind of thing that we argue is for the third prong, where the third prong is that on balance, the individual shouldn't have to go through the labor certification process. And the government has said that the labor certification process, where you have to prove, look, if a company is sponsoring you for a green card under other categories, you have to prove that the company couldn't find a qualified US worker. But here we argue that, for an E2 visa holder or an entrepreneur, they're not able to actually apply for the labor certification because it's their own company. So we argue that, that particular prong is not really applicable. So that's we take different strategies depending on the case, but definitely it's a case that does require strategy. And then it doesn't have to be that the business is even, I think, as far along as an E2 would require the business to be before you applied. And it doesn't have to be that the business is absolutely successful. It just, it has to be that there's a reasonable chance that the business is going to succeed. I think the standard they use is more likely than not. And then if we look at this case study for entrepreneurs and we see that what it comes from is, a lot of the details on the slide, but let me just describe it. What it comes from is a case where the individual was starting, and the case stresses multiple times, a small consulting company. And the consulting company was providing services to vets to reintegrate into the society after they came back from combat. And it was approved. It ultimately was approved because when it went through the appeal process, it was approved. And the appeals board described why, and it basically said that this was in the national importance. The government has always said that it was in the national importance. It didn't matter that it was a small company, that the standard didn't require that it impact all of the United States. And then the person was well positioned because they had letters from government officials, businesses, other people, leaders attesting to the prior success, like track record with respect to this. He had a business plan. He had enough money to capitalize the company. He had emails from prospective clients, so kind of letters of intent and things like that. And then on the third prong, they argued was the person was self-employed. So even though it was a small company, but self-employed, so that prong was not really applicable. And then we often use a lot of the same arguments that we use in prong 1 and prong 2 here as well. So that's that's a good example. So now we included this in the slide, but we're not going to spend much time on it. The International Parole program. Now, this is a program that was introduced during the Obama administration, but then the next administration kind of sidelined it. And so there weren't really any applications that were filed, and then the Biden administration picked it up again. But the program has a lot of flaws, unfortunately, because what it is, it's a program that can give you the status called parole, where if you're in the United States, you have to leave and you have to re-enter. And then when you file it, you're not afforded any benefit in the United States, and they're taking over, sometimes a year to be approved. There have been a handful of approvals of this type of petition in the US, but it's not the greatest petition, but sometimes it could be available, for example, for someone who isn't a treaty country member. Because if you're eligible for any other type of visa, I'd recommend do that, right? But if you have no other options, then the International Entrepreneur Parole program could be an option, and you have to own at least 10% of the company. And then the main other criteria is that you have, you're going to have a business plan, and then the main other criteria is that you're going to have some other type of investment. So it could be like from a venture capital fund or a qualified U.S. investor. That the amount seems odd on the slide, 147,000, but it's scaled with inflation. So, but I think that, like I said, if you're not eligible for any other visa type, then I think that it's one to look at. But I think that other than that, it's not one that we spend a lot of time on. And so the next investor visa is one that we do spend quite a bit of time on, and this one is EB5, and again, this is a green card. So this is a green card category that we use often, and we do what's called EB5 direct investments. I think, as I said, we do have a webinar related to this as well. And so what this particular program has undergone a significant amount of change. The most significant change occurred in March of 2022. And so, the changes I'll outline as I go through the requirements. So the first part of this is that you have to invest either 800,000 or 1,050,000. And the difference is going to be, you have to invest in what's called a new commercial enterprise. So that's an enterprise that was started after 1990. So it doesn't have to be brand new. It's new is considered after that date. So the 800, it's going to be either the 800,000 or the 1,050,000 depending on where the business is located. If the business is located in what's called a targeted employment area or a rural area, targeted employment area is an area where the unemployment rate is 1.5 times the national average, then it's going to be $800,000 investment. And then if not, it's going to be the higher investment amount. So, the investment has to be, kind of spent on things that are all related to, they're all related to job creation, right? So you have to, like, you couldn't be buying equipment, it can be buying furniture, it can be buying lease, spending money on lease, employees, all things related to job creation. The money has to be spent on, and their administrative fees can't be included. So if you invested 800,000, you couldn't use some of that money to pay for legal fees or things like that. The investment can be made over time. It doesn't have to be made all at once. So sometimes when we do E2 to EB5, we don't, the investment isn't made immediately. It might be made like in year one, the person invested X, 10 years later, they invested another 100,000, et cetera. So that's something to keep in mind. And then investment doesn't mean retained earnings. So if money was sitting, like, let's say someone made $1 million and the money was sitting there in retained earnings, and then they spent that money the next year in the business, that is not investment for the purposes of EB5. So that's something to keep in mind. It has to be, in money that you personally have invested into the company. The other kind of thing to keep in mind is the source of funds. The source of funds for EB5 is nothing like E2, although on paper they seem like they're the same requirement. It's a much more in-depth, analysis that is done. And then, it does have to be kind of, an equity investment. So that's something to keep in mind. So in terms of job creation, the job creation you have to create 10 full-time jobs. So that's not part-time jobs, and it's not, it's full-time jobs, and they have to be jobs for U.S. citizens or green card holders. So very important that you have to check the documentation of the people. And as I said, the job creation the investment has to be linked to job creation. So that's a very, very important part of the whole analysis. And we had one case where we had done the case, and it was for farm. And when we were looking at some of the full-time people, like, they had provided false information, documents, and things like that. So that's always something you have to keep in mind, because it is going to be highly scrutinized. So you definitely want to follow the I-9 compliance requirements. For this particular petition, you're going to be filing an I-526. Those take quite a long time, like over 4 years, to be adjudicated. But then we also have an I-485 that can be filed concurrently. So that's something that can be done, and that gives significant amount of benefit, especially given that the petitions take a long time to be filed. And then after that, 2 years later, the person's going to be we're going to file an I-829 petition, and that's going to remove the conditions. So there we see the various types of investor visas. And as I said, they're kind of high-level summary. And for all of these, including even the International Entrepreneur Rule, we have separate webinars that you can take a look at, and or sign up for future webinars, because I know that in February we're going to do another EB5 direct investment green card webinar, and then we are also going to do more on various immigration topics. So definitely something to sign up for. Perfect. And now we will move to questions and answers. And I'm looking at the Q&A and chat boxes, and I don't see any questions here. So if we don't have any questions, then we'll give it a couple seconds to see if anybody types in a question. But I don't see any questions. So with that, as I said, what we will do is we will send you a recording for this webinar, and we will also send you the guides, the guides for the webinar. And we will also send you some information related to how you could set up a consultation. And yeah, and we do have a question here. Can lawyer fees count towards investment amount? So if you're referring to E2, then yes. If you're referring to EB5, then no. So legal fees can be included as investment amount for E2, but not for EB5. So the next question is, I've been running my online business for 3 years. Could I include what I've spent in the past 3 years to investment amount? Well, I think that it depends, but probably not. So certainly not for EB5. So if you're referring to EB5, then absolutely not. The entity has to be set up in the US, and that entity. Sorry, let me rephrase that. I'm assuming the entity. Okay, so the person is referring to E2. And I'm assuming the entity is in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. or where is the entity? Maybe if you just waiting for the person to answer where the entity is. Okay, so we'll just handle both of them. So if the entity is outside the US, then I think that it's, including costs related to that entity is not going to work because the costs don't relate to any entity in the US, right? They relate to the entity that's outside of the US. If the entity is in the United States and it's been running for 3 years, then you would be able to include investment that was made where you personally invested into the company. You wouldn't be able to include money that the company generated and then spent, right? So hopefully that distinction is clear, but that is the answer. And another question here, is it possible to register and operate a business in the US without a visa through a US employer? Absolutely. There's no requirement to have a visa when you open up a business in the US. It's not required at all. You need a visa to work in a business in the US. So that's anyone can set up an entity in the U.S. as long as they're meeting the tax requirements, et cetera. But you just need a visa to work in the U.S. Okay, so there are a bunch more questions coming in now. Okay, so the person was in Canada. Okay. Yeah, so if you're in Canada and you have a business in Canada and you were spending money in Canada, none of that money can be used for the business in the US because it didn't, like, the idea is it didn't relate to it, right? Like you would have had that money, like anything you spent, you would have been putting it in Canadian tax returns, and so that the other visa you might want to look at though is if many of your clients are in the US, you might want to look at an E1 visa. So. I've purchased a few things from the US and have shipped to Canada. Well, no, I mean, it's still the things you purchased in the US and shipped to Canada, they're still for your Canadian company, right? So if they're physical items that you still have that you're going to donate to the US company, then there might be an argument for those physical items, but certainly none of the intangible items like marketing or anything like that. Can education count towards investment amount? For example, an online nutrition certificate. I think that was a good example of a not great E2 expense. Now, the reason is because, like, we will sometimes include discrete courses like the one you mentioned, like an online nutrition certificate, if it's a low dollar amount or something like that. But the reason we're reluctant to include education expenses is because arguably, like, I received an E2 visa, for example, for a law firm, and I couldn't make the argument that the $200,000 that I paid for law school was part of the investment amount, right? Or if I made the argument, it wouldn't be a good one. You can hire 1099 contractors, but employees are better. Okay, so the person wrote, I missed the first part, any visas with non-treaty countries. With respect to non-treaty countries, in the past, what was possible was the person could purchase citizenship from another country. So they could purchase citizenship from Grenada or Turkey or some other country. And some countries, it was very easy to purchase. So Grenada was very easy to purchase, and you can get the citizenship within months even. But they just changed the law with the last few weeks ago, and now you have to reside in if you do like E2 through investment, you have to have resided in the country for 3 years. So it's going to significantly curbed the ability to do that. How do I start buy a business in the United States before I have a visa? Well, you can enter on a B1 visa, and then do all the investigation and due diligence and buy the business. So that's definitely possible to do. Lots of our clients do it. Will there be an issue if I have a different visa application, such an I-130 and E2? My spouse is American. and I want to start a business in the US. So if you have an American spouse, the American spouse is eligible to sponsor you under the immediate relative category for a green card. So if you're outside of the US, that can be done, through a consulate. If you do come to the US, if you have a visa, where you could enter the US, and then and then you decided while you were in the US to change status to an E2, you could certainly do that. You could certainly do that. I think that if you applied for an E2 at a consulate, they may recognize that you have a spouse that's in the US, and they may question whether or not your plan is to go to the US and adjust status. So I think it could be tricky getting an E2 at a consulate if you have a US citizen spouse. But if you have, again, though, if you have a US citizen spouse, then if you want to go to the US, probably the option is, you have the option of getting a green card. So that's something to keep in mind. Perfect. So yeah, it went from no questions to a lot of questions, which is absolutely great. It's fantastic. But I don't see any more. So I think we will close this here. And thank you everybody for joining. And as I said, definitely feel free to set up a consultation, and we could go over your specific fact pattern with you in more detail. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.